Okay, and welcome back. This is part 3 of a series that I'm doing over old Red cinema cameras. Go check out the last 2 videos if you want to see how this series started. I bought a Red Monstro, then I compared it to the Red Dragon, and now today we are going to be comparing it to a DSMC3 Red, the Red Komodo X. The Red Komodo X is in a similar price point as something like the Red Monstro, although the Red Monstro is the older flagship camera. It's full frame, it's 8K, it should best the Komodo X in pretty much every way, except for some of the modern functionality that the Komodo X has. But I think this will be a really good comparison because they are in a similar price point, and your one has the more modern tech in it and one is a little bit older. I did go with the Red Monstro myself, but let's see if that was the right decision for me. Of course, the Red Monstro is full frame and the Komodo X is a little bit bigger than Super 35. The Komodo X is a global shutter 6K, shoots up to 80 frames per second, whereas the Monstro is full frame 8K and shoots up to 60 frames per second on the full sensor, but you can crop in on that and get much more higher frame rates, which would be comparable to the X practically speaking. Now, I don't want to get too far into what the Red Monstro offers because I've already covered that so much in the last 2 videos. I just highly suggest you go check out those videos now. But the quick things just to get out of the way is just really the size. Like, look how small this little Komodo X is. Now, this is pretty much the smallest you can make the package. It's just got the little micro V-mount on the back of it. It's got the touch screen monitor that should go with the DSMC3 line. And so it just has the one little USB-C cable that runs at the top. And then I've got a little 5-pock M mount lens on here, which is also really fun. And just makes everything really tiny. So both kits here have the I/O module to give them, more I/O on them. This one also has an I/O module on it, the Komodo X, and then it's a gold mount adapter basically. Then I've got this little wireless module on here to make it gold mount as well. Both have little baby thigh-pock lenses on them. We'll talk about putting M-mount lenses on the Monstro here in a future video. They both have a card in them. They both have their touch screens on top and a red top handle. This red top handle is obviously much smaller and lighter than this large metal one. But this kit here weighs under 15 pounds, and then this kit is about 9 pounds. So give or take a 5-pound difference. But really, all I'm trying to test here is image quality. How do they both perform? So as per usual, I did a really quick side-by-side test here. I shot both of these at 800 ISO, although the Monstro really could be rated at 1600 ISO, and really the X could be rated at 400. I did 800 just to have a nice baseline between the two cameras. Processed everything the same. They're both using Red RAW, of course. I did an 8:1 compression ratio on the Monstro, and then I did a medium quality on the Komodo X, just to give them a little bit of a similar baseline when it comes to compression. I could have done 5:1 on the Monstro, but then that would have given it kind of the edge, or I could have done high quality on the Komodo, but pretty much you're never going to be shooting at high quality on the Komodo X unless you're doing visual effects work or something like that. So just like when I did the comparison with the Monstro and the regular OG Komodo, the Komodo color science right out of camera leans much, much warmer and not as saturated, not as poppy, and definitely leans more green. Now, these things can be tweaked, of course. It is a modern RAW cinema camera. But right out of camera, the Monstro once again wins by a lot, in my opinion, when it comes to straight out of camera color. Just like the Komodo and the Dragon even, they have different clipping points. A lot of that is due to the full frame sensor. It should let in a little bit more light, but really the sensors are calibrated differently and are going to perform differently. You are going to have to stop down the lens a little bit farther to get the highlights to not clip on the Monstro. But just like with the other cameras that I've tested this against, the Monstro still has a very good shadow latitude. But really, looking at these images, the Komodo X has pretty decent shadow latitude. I would say that it's pretty competitive, and I was a little bit surprised by this. You can check out both of the cameras with just a quick, nice grade on them. They both look very good with a grade on them. The Monstro is coming in on top on that. It just has more color separation. It has just more tonality overall, which is just a little bit surprising, but which I'm guessing that's because of the 16-bit analog to digital converter in the Monstro. So it's just a higher end camera overall from a tech standpoint, although the Komodo X is very capable. But let's go back to the color real quick. Look at the whites on the background. It's just crazy how the Monstro just is basically always performing better in the blues and the whites, whereas the OG Komodo and the Komodo X that you can see here just lean kind of brown. They're like this warm color, they got some green in it, and whites just don't go pure white. And now if you do white balance this the best you can to get that pure white, the other colors in the image are not going to look exactly the same, which is really surprising to me. I've shown the Komodo for years now and the Komodo X very extensively. I've never really noticed this to be a problem, but when you are doing it side by side with the Monstro, it's just so clear how much more color depth the Monstro seems to have. A lot more color separation and much more accurate white balance. But then I really wanted to kind of step this up a little bit, and I wanted to do a kind of over-under exposure test. This is the standard of tests recently online, and it's an interesting thing. I really have been looking a lot of how CineD does their lab tests, and I think a couple other people online, I think Jake Hayden does these sort of over-under exposure tests as well. So go check out their stuff if you want to see how they kind of handle that. But I wanted to do this myself, but I generally have stayed away from these type of tests because I can't really make it that scientific, right? This is just like kind of a baseline for myself to see how the cameras handle. But I have to say, and just like I've always preached on the channel, it really does not matter. It comes down to what does the image look like for you, and does it look good when you're using it for that camera. Now, I know I do a lot of side-by-sides on this channel because it does give you a reference point, right? But it's just like going to Best Buy and looking at TVs, right? Like, the better TV is just always going to look better next to a crappy TV. But if you're just watching a crappy TV, do you even notice? Kind of an age-old debate, honestly. But it really shows here. But I thought I would do this test anyways, just to kind of see what I get out of it. So I think the difference with my kind of over-under exposure test that I did here is I basically am exposing for skin tones, right? And that's how most people do that. But I was using it where I would actually expose skin. So it's actually exposing around 40 IRE, which might make it look a little bit different from some other tests that you might see. So based on this, let's just quickly go through the Komodo X here. Here it is at 0 exposure. And then here it is at -1. And then here it is at, I actually skipped -2, went straight to -3 because I'm like, what's the point here? -3, it starts to show that it's underexposed. -4 looks pretty bad. The grain structure isn't terrible though. I think it doesn't look that bad. It doesn't have weird fixed noise patterns. It just looks like grain versus noise. And with a little bit of noise reduction, it does come back. But to emphasize my point on doing these tests, we do these tests to see kind of how good the sensor is, but I would never push the camera this far down. I pretty much always try to properly light. And if you are going to expose a scene correctly, even if you're running and gunning, I just don't feel like you're going to run into these issues and see a camera in this environment. Obviously, we're trying to see just how far the latitude goes on the low end, just as some sort of reference point. -5, kind of the same thing. It does look really bad at -5, and it does clean up, but I don't think I would fully call it usable. It is really pushing it. Now, how the noise reduction is handling on the face, which I guess is the part that we really should focus on because that's what we're exposed for, on the shadow side of the face, at least looks not too bad. Like, the noise reduction does handle pretty well on the Komodo X. Now let's jump over to the Monstro real quick and do the same thing. When we're going down on exposure here, same thing kind of happens. We get to about -4, and the image starts to really fall apart. It does kind of come back with noise reduction, but doesn't look as good maybe as the X in some cases. They both have different luma and chroma noise going on. Noise reduction seems to create some sort of like line patterns on the Monstro, whereas it didn't really do that on the Komodo X. So take that as you will. I never, ever use noise reduction. I never put a camera in a scenario to use this, but it does seem like the Monstro kind of doesn't look quite as good in that way. But because it is an 8K sensor and it does clearly have a little bit more going on with it, the detail holds better on the Monstro. So just kind of depends what you're looking for when you are pushing a camera that far. At -5, same thing. It just looks pretty bad. So basically, let's just call it -4 for both cameras. Is really where we would be comfortable with. Now, maybe if you're a little bit better at noise reduction, I don't use noise reduction very often, so I don't play with it too much. I just really don't like what it's doing to the image. This is why I like to shoot red raw. I like to have the best image I can get without anything, touching it already. And that's why a lot of these modern cameras, like mirrorless cameras and stuff like that, they have noise reduction built in. I just don't really like how that is affecting the image, so that's why I like to shoot on red raw cameras, specifically. So I wouldn't really be doing this, but this is a reference point. So let's do the overexposure so we can kind of see how big the latitude really is. Back to the Komodo X, based on how I had the skin at 40 IRE basically, that gives us a lot more room in the highlights compared to maybe how CineD does it where they expose for 60 IRE, so they're going to have less headroom. So I kind of did this with more headroom. And I don't know if that affects it truly, but it just seemed like that's kind of what was going on here. So for me, I was getting 4 stops up on the Komodo X, very easily go to 4. And on my way to 5, it starts to clip. So we jump over to the Monstro, same thing happens, but the Monstro did clip at 5, like pretty hardcore. Whereas 4 looks perfect, 4 looks perfect on the Komodo X. It's when you start working your way towards 5 is when you start to see the discrepancy. It does seem like the Komodo X looks pretty decent closer to 5 stops. Okay, editor Spencer here. I think what's going on, why the Monstro is so clipped, I'm actually looking at the waveforms now. It does look like I had the Monstro probably a half a stop or more overexposed here right in camera, and that's why my face is so clipped on the Monstro. It just didn't make sense to me. Like, they should be very much close in exposure latitude here, especially with that full frame sensor. That was a mistake on my part, so keep that in mind. These should be closer than they look here. They look dramatically different at +5. I think that's because my +5 was closer to a +6. So there you go. It's fair to say they both clip at past 4, and I wouldn't, you just can't really use them past 4. So that being said, it seems like they both have an overexposure of 4 and an underexposure of 4, so that's about 8 stops of latitude based on how I did my test. Now, not super scientific, I used an ND filter and pulled one stop at a time basically to make this work. I could have stopped down the lens. You just can't really trust how these stops are measured on anything that you're doing, but this is a good reference point, somewhere around 8, which is pretty good for a modern camera. I wish I was getting closer to 9 on the Monstro, so it was a little bit closer to maybe the Raptor based on Cine D's test. It's just really not that scientific on how we're doing it, and once you start adding noise reduction to anything, I'm just like, we're not, this is silly now. Like, we shouldn't be talking about this. So if we actually judged from that, they both only have like 7 stops, maybe even less of full exposure if you did not want to add noise reduction. What you're going to see is that the Monstro holds color better. It just overall is going to hold more color. It's probably because of that. It just does have that 16-bit ADC in it. So it's just actually obtaining more colors than the Komodo. And you're going to have more color separation on the Monstro. So I have to say, this was a surprising test. I thought the Komodo X was not going to compete as well as it did with the Monstro. So it's exciting for Komodo X users. I still think the color coming out of the Komodo X straight out of the camera is far inferior to the Monstro, which is unfortunate. But there's a lot of trade-offs for the X. It is just simply smaller. It's got the modern tech in it. Very easy to accessorize compared to the heavier red Monstro. But this is Super 35 versus the full frame, whatever you need. I've talked about this already. It's not about the sensor size, really. I like the size of the sensor on the Monstro because I can use the full optical quality of a lens. So these modern full frame lenses, the look comes from the full circle. So you get the nicer fall off and whatnot if you're shooting on a full frame camera. This is actually what we should be talking about more when we're talking about Super 35 and full frame at this point, because when most people were talking about Super 35 versus full frame, that was before all these full frame lenses were on the market. But now there's a lot of full frame cinema lenses. I shoot on the RLs and I have the 5-box now. I want to see what the character's going to do on a full sensor. Seeing the full image circle of those lenses and see how they perform versus cropping in on them and losing some of that bokeh and texture and what it's doing on the sides of the image. So I prefer full frame. That's just where I'm going with it. But Super 35 is great. If you need global shutter, go with the X. If not, the Monstro is awesome. It just really is. You're going to get a couple more modern features, obviously, with the DSMC3 camera like the Komodo X. You're going to get a locking RF mount versus a swappable PL, EF, whatever you want for the Monstro. I actually have an M mount on here, which we'll talk about on hopefully the next video on how that kind of works. You have like app control and stuff like that for the Komodo X, and it's much, much smaller, so it's easier to fly on something like a gimbal, like an RS3 or 4 Pro, whereas the Monstro is not going to go on one of those at all. You're going to have to put the Monstro on something like a much bigger Ronin 2 or something like that if you want to use gimbals. Okay, I think I've talked about the Monstro plenty, so I don't want to go into too much more detail, but before we go, I do want to talk about this video's sponsor, which is Squarespace. Squarespace is an all-in-one platform to present your work online. Start a completely personalized website with design intelligence from Squarespace. Design intelligence empowers anyone to build a beautiful, bespoke digital identity to use across your entire online presence. Maybe you want to start an online store to sell your photography or other products. Squarespace has the built-in functionality to get one of those up and running quickly, and I've actually been using Squarespace to run my online stores for almost a decade now. And of course, if you're like me, you're probably looking to build a portfolio, which Squarespace has tons of features for that very thing. You can even create private galleries for client work using these tools. And as you acquire work through your website, you can now collect payments using branded invoices, manage client info, feedback, and payment activity all in one place. So if you're looking for a home for your work, you can do that with Squarespace. Squarespace. Click the link in the description to get 10% off, and I want to thank Squarespace for sponsoring this video. But hopefully this helps some of you when it comes to picking your next camera, and if you're in the market for a red camera, maybe this sheds some light on some of that for you. Definitely go watch the other videos if you haven't already and you are curious about red cameras. Do compare the red Monstro to the Komodo and the Dragon. It'd be awesome to compare it to a Raptor at some point, but I don't have access to one of those right now, but if I do in the future, I will try to get that done. Okay, well, as always, until next time, guys, I'm Suja Sakurai. See ya.